Hi, welcome to episode 4, Mensuration Nation. Today I want to use the old way of talking about musical meter, which was called mensural notation. And they had this different way of thinking about meters. Well, kind of different. It's actually the same way we think about it today, but with some added bells and whistles and a weird obsession with the number 3. Let's get into it by listening to some stuff we listened to last time. I want to start with good old this. So, Stars and Stripes Forever. I feel like at the level of the beat, there's 2 beats a bar. And then each one of those bars has 4 divisions, 2 divisions per beat. And at the level of the bar, like we said, there's just 2 beats in every bar. But I think there's more to it. If we listen, I'd say there's definitely a hypermeter. Now, a hypermeter is just a level of pulse that is above the bar. And that means it doesn't even happen every bar. Right? It happens every other bar. So, strong bar, weak bar. Strong bar, weak bar. Strong bar, weak bar. We could talk about another level of hypermeter. Just for fun, I'm going to call it hypermeter. That's not what it's called. But it wouldn't repeat in this bar or this bar. It would repeat here, right? Here's the hypermeter. There'd be a beat here. A bar, a beat, and a division. This towering stack of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dots only repeats every 4 bars in the hypermeter. Seems weird to talk about that way, and in fact, we don't really anymore. If you remember when I was talking about tempo inflation, remember how in the olden days, the notes we now consider to be really long, like a whole note, was actually considered a short note. In fact, a whole note was considered half of a short note. There was a short note called the short or the breve, and there was a long note called the longa, and half a breve was a semi-breve. So there was these longa notes. There was a breve, which was kind of square or TIE fighter-ish. And then the round guy was a semi-breve, half a breve. Long, short, half short, if we called them their English translations of their Latin names. The half short note is now what we call a whole note. And a whole note, like I said, is one of our kind of long notes. So it's not necessarily that ancient composers and musicians were paying attention to way longer chunks of time. It's just that their notes were longer. Anyhow, they had 4 different names for 4 different relationships among hierarchical levels of pulse strings. They called the relationship between the hypermeter and the meter kind of level today, they called this maximodus. And then they had modus down here. And then, more important for us, this relationship between bars and beats, they called tempus, like time, right? And then this relationship between the beat and the division, they called prolatio. As the writing of music with durational values or mensural music really took off and things got more complicated than just going like long, short, long, short, long, short, long, and stuff like that, the composers really started to focus in on these 2 levels. Basically, the relationship between the beat and the measure, though they didn't have the measure as we know it back then, but they still had this hierarchical proportional relationship. And then the beat and the division the other way. And this, like I said, they called the tempus, and this they called the prolatio. Who's this they? These guys are mostly monks, scholar monks, in the Catholic Church. That's where our Western system of musical notation comes from. And these monks at this time were kind of obsessed with the Holy Trinity. And it's not just in music, it's in lots of arts. There was a time when just there was kind of this magical love of the number 3. Maybe there still is today. 3 was considered the perfect number. And therefore, when musicians back then were writing a time signature, and they were just talking about how many beats are in a bar, at least that's how we would say it today. Back then, like I said, they didn't have a bar. It wasn't called that. Anyhow, they considered time to break into groups of 3 or groups of 2. And groups of 3, they called perfect. So this is 3 beats per measure. That was considered a perfect tempus. 3 is perfect. It was represented with a circle. The circle is a perfect shape. It has no beginning or end. It's perfectly round. If instead there were 2 beats per measure, that was imperfect. I don't think it was really a value judgment. There's plenty of music back then that has 2 beats per measure, but it's just, this is what they called it, an imperfect tempus. And they took their perfect shape, which is a circle, and they turned it into half a circle, which looks just like a C. And in fact, this C is still with us today. Many times our time signature 4/4, one of our most common time signatures today, is called common time. And a lot of people think because it's called common time, we abbreviate it to C and just write a C instead of 4/4. But really, the C is a holdover from the 14th century. So in a perfect tempus, there's 3 beats a measure. In an imperfect tempus, there's 2 beats a measure. That means our John Philip Sousa is an imperfect tempus. Let's listen again. 2 beats a measure, right? So its time signature would have a C back then, or its mensural symbol, or whatever they called it. They didn't call it a time signature. Back then, they also honed in on the prolatio, how many divisions per beat. And they represented this also by a symbol of perfection. Let's try a different song really quick. Let's try this jig. This is the Irish Rovers playing the Sweet Biddy Daily Jig. So, like often with a jig, I'm hearing 2 beats a measure, and each beat is dividing into 3 divisions. Right? Those are the beats, and then the divisions are like... So, because there are 2 beats a measure, just like Stars and Stripes Forever, this jig is an imperfect tempus. However, this jig is an imperfect tempus, but a perfect prolatio. Except they don't call it perfect, they call it major prolatio. So a major prolatio means the beat divides into 3s. You can also have a minor prolatio. And a minor prolatio doesn't have the dot. So think of the dot as kind of like the circle. The circle is the perfect shape. Imperfect is half a circle. The dot is the perfect shape, and therefore we call it the major shape. Whereas the lack of dot is imperfect. And the same thing happens with the circle. So a circle with a dot in it is perfect tempus with major prolatio. And a circle without a dot is perfect tempus with minor prollatio. And so the way these all end up looking when we're going to talk about these like dot diagrams, right? A perfect tempus with minor prollatio means there are 3 beats a bar, and each beat divides into 2s. So the 3 beats a bar is because it's a perfect tempus. The dividing into 2s is because it's a minor prollatio. A major prollatio with a perfect tempus would look like this. 3 beats a bar, each with 3 divisions. The most perfect Holy Trinity, 3 in 3, to these ancient monk type guys. Imperfect tempus has 2 beats. If it's a minor prollatio, that means each beat has 2 divisions. In other words, here's the one, if we were back in John Philip Sousa's time, we would call his, if John Philip Sousa went back to the 14th century and played his little march, they would call it an imperfect tempus with a minor prollatio. Whereas if those Irish rovers roved back to ancient times and played their jig, they would have a C with a dot in it, a major prolation into 3s, but an imperfect tempus into 2s. And these were kind of just the 4 ways they had time signatures back then. Now again, going back to the tempo inflation idea, that was ongoing as these developed. So every one of these has an alternate form with a line through it, and that just cuts the notes in half. So back in the 14th century, there were specific note values, somewhere way up high, like in this longa and brev, or longa type range. There's another note longer than a longa. And then if the piece was going to use half the note values, they indicated that by writing the mensural symbol, but with a line through it. It could be through the one with a dot too, and it could be through the C, and it could be through the C with a dot. And just as this C still survives today as our 4/4 time signature, the C with the line through it survives today, as our 2/2 time signature, also known as cut time. Also known as alla breve, or alla brev, which is super weird because it makes it sound like the brev is the beat, but it's because the brev used to be the beat. Nowadays, in 2/2, the half note is the beat. And otherwise, it has the same amount of duration as 4/4. In a 4/4 signature, though, there are 4 quarter notes that get the beat, right? So you could interpret music in 4/4 as though it only has 2 beats instead of 4, and that's what people mean when they say halftime. And in music, halftime is like cut time, and cut time has used this symbol ever since back then, just like common time has used that symbol. Okay,